Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Well, hello, Psychonauts. Here we are again at Shattered Reality. My name is Fahrusha, and today is April 10th, 2018. And most unfortunately, once again today, my partner in crime, Miss Kate Valentine, cannot be with us, and we're hoping to welcome her back for our next episode, which will be in a couple weeks. But today we have a real treat, sort of wonderful in his own right, but sort of a follow-up to his wife, who was on here about 3 shows ago. We have Mr. Mark Boccuzzi, who is the co-founder of the Windbridge Institute, and he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science with a minor in broadcast communications. Mark has spent more than a decade investigating spontaneous cases of apparitions and related haunted phenomena in the San Fransisco Bay Area and southern Arizona. In 2005, he successfully completed the summer study program in parapsychology presented by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, also known to many of us as IONS, and the Rhine Research Center. He is an associate member of the Parapsychological Association. Mark's research interests include intuition, animal psi, applied psychokinesis, photographic anomalies, distant mental interactions on living systems, and instrumental transcommunication, also known as ITC. He is a 2-time recipient of grants from the Helene Reader Memorial Fund for Research into Life After Death, and a recipient of a grant from the Parapsychological Association Gilbert Roller Fund. Mark's research has been presented at the annual meetings of the Society for Scientific Exploration and the Parapsychological Association, and toward a Science of Consciousness and International Society for Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, otherwise known as ICEM. He is published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and he is the author of a book and deck of cards called Visualizing Intention, Art Informed by Science. Welcome, Mark Boccuzzi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure entirely. I think that we would like to start today, or I would like to start today, with what you did before you became the co-founder of the Windbridge Institute. I'm sorry.
Institute. Yeah, that's, it's debatable. So I'm not a traditionally trained scientist. My wife, for example, Dr. Julie Beischel, who's the co-founder of the Institute with me and is now also the director of research at the recently formed Windbridge Research Center. She went down the very traditional PhD route. I started off, as you said, I have a background in computer science, and I've always been interested in the paranormal, and I'm using finger quotes to say paranormal, but things like ghosts and Bigfoot and UFOs and all the things that parapsychology studies. And I kind of realized at an early age that it would probably be very difficult for me to make any kind of living doing that work full time. So I ended up going into computer science. And then after I graduated from college, I ended up working in the software industry for a number of years. And I was a producer, and I produced video games.
Cool.
And then I started working for different nonprofit organizations, and eventually I sort of got onto a more formal science track, and I became a project manager at a museum, and I was overseeing projects that We're funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, which kind of introduced me to that world. And but always in the background was my sort of interest in parapsychology. And I realized that while formal studies in things like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition would require lots of specialized equipment and laboratory space and participants, the study of allegedly haunted locations, on the other hand, really just required me to go to those locations. So I started doing that, and I started visiting sites all over California, and I started collecting data and interviewing people who had ghost experiences, and started working on protocols and processes. And I learned a lot about how data collection works and how science works. And I was a big fan of the Parapsychological Foundation, or the Parapsychology Foundation, sorry. And I used a lot of their training materials at the time. And so one thing led to another. And it was in 2005 that I had the opportunity to attend the summer study program in parapsychology. And that was taking place at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, at their campus in Petaluma, and it was a joint.
Beautiful.
It's a great location.
Can we take you back for a second, just to go back to your time in the San Francisco Bay Area when you were investigating these apparitions and haunting phenomenon. Could you please give us an example of something you may have learned or an experience you may have had that maybe propelled you onward?
Well, what I learned about ghost hunting or paranormal investigation in the field is that it's really, really boring. You spend a lot of time hunkered down in different places, and often the results aren't satisfying, especially when you're looking at them through the lens of empirical research. There are lots of great ghost stories, and there are lots of people who report all kinds of different phenomena. But oftentimes we couldn't recreate those effects. Oftentimes we would find that, not often, but we would sometimes find that the people that were reporting them, there were other issues involved. And so when you focused on those other personal issues or interpersonal issues, a lot of the phenomena didn't hang around. It sort of went away. Mm-hmm. So there was that. And then there were so I would investigate both private homes and also haunted locations like the USS Hornet in Alameda, California, which is an aircraft carrier, World War II aircraft carrier, which is now a museum. And that has a bunch of great haunted history and stories around it. And I was able to get on board that ship and spend the night there a number of times, and made a lot of visits there. But the problem when you're trying to collect controlled data, environmental data, or even record for electronic voice phenomena or things like that, is that an aircraft carrier is a really difficult place to control its environment. Right? It's cold, it's big, it echoes, there's raccoons, whatever. Like it's a very difficult environment to work in.
And things are not repeatable exactly. You can't reproduce it. That's what makes some of this difficult to scientifically investigate, because phenomena don't necessarily repeat. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were spending a lot of time, me and my team were spending a lot of time sort of just trying to document whatever spontaneous phenomena would pop up. But and we had, photographic anomalies and some strange EVPs and objects that moved which shouldn't have and things like that. But so I'm definitely convinced that there's something going on, but it's really difficult to sort of tie that down or really, for me, to feel really satisfied with getting more concrete or definitive answers from that line of work. Mm-hmm. And then over the years, it also just it it became more and more difficult. Ghost hunting in general started to become much more popular. And so there were these sort of gangs of ghost hunting groups that were showing up at different locations. And then certain locations would not allow the level of access that they had previously because there are all these people running around now. Other places would inflate the kinds of phenomena that were being reported. So you never really knew if you were going somewhere that had legitimate phenomena or just marketing.
Right.
And yeah, so it just became sort of a trial. And then the other thing that happened too, which was interesting, was the public became really aware or sort of what I call paranormally primed. So with all the ghost hunting shows that were on TV and the popularity of all this stuff in the media, every little thing that people would normally take a step back and go, oh, well, that was strange, I'll think critically about that, suddenly became a ghost instantaneously. So, and I actually wrote a paper about this. It's in our journal, Threshold, that looks at the changes in language that were used in my early days of paranormal investigation in the field, of when people would email me requests for investigations in the first few years versus the second half of the, I think it was 6 years that I did investigations. And it's a drastic change in the language that's used to describe the events over time. In the beginning, people were much more inquisitive and sort of engaged. And in the more recent time, it's much more like, there's a ghost in my house, get it out of here now, right? Like it's very direct. And I don't want to put all that change on just paranormal television and how our belief in the paranormal may have changed, because we communicate very differently now, especially electronically, right? People used to sit down and write emails and send, which were basically electronic letters, and now it's just whatever microblog or tweet or text or whatever, So, but it's the difference is really striking. It was an interesting revelation for me to see the change, and I think as that change happened, my sort of interests changed as well. I'll still do field investigation if there's something really, really interesting, but it's not really where I put my efforts these days.
Well, just to wrap that part up, I would say that if you have a network or a production company spending money and going to a location, they want something to happen, even if they have to push it a little bit. Because they spent some money there.
I would assume that it's interesting because even the way the shows had progressed over the years, like there were some ghost paranormal shows where like the first couple of seasons, it was all like, oh, look, we're going to this place and who's getting scared and what's the interpersonal dynamics between the team members. And then suddenly it was like, and they very seldom found a ghost. And then suddenly it was like every place they went to found a ghost.
Exactly.
Right? They would find ghosts.
They had to have that marketing going on there to keep the show going.
So, and I get it. It's entertainment. It's unscripted entertainment, and that's fine. It's those shows were never meant to be scientific or documentaries about paranormal phenomena. They were meant to be fun and tell a scary story, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, but they changed public expectation of what can be reproducible or how readily one can find paranormal phenomena.
Yeah, that is very true. It really did sort of frame not only the public's understanding or how they came to understand or believe or frame paranormal events, but also from a paranormal investigation perspective, it really sort of, a lot of those shows really set the template of how those investigative groups would work. And a lot of those methods are actually really poor. So, and they kind of got carried over because these were things that people were seeing on TV. And so they're like, oh, I have a piece of equipment, so now I'm suddenly scientific.
Yes.
And my big thing is equipment is good and equipment is useful, but it's just equipment. Science is a method. So it doesn't matter what kind of equipment you have. It really matters on how you're using it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So moving on from the San Francisco Bay Area apparitions, etc., you then went on to study at the Rhine Research Center program, which was produced at Petaluma at IONS, yes?
Yeah, that's correct. And I had the pleasure of, hearing lectures from Dean Radin and Christine Simmons Moore and a number of other prominent researchers, and they were great. And I also, while I was there, met Dr. Julie Beischel. And what was interesting about that was that at the time, she was finishing her she was in the middle of her postdoc studying mediumship at the University of Arizona. And it was pretty much me and maybe a couple of other people that were interested in survival. But the rest of the group there was sort of just interested in general parapsychology topics. And that's sort of the running joke. That's sort of my running joke in parapsychology is, it's telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, mind-matter interaction, and we'll put up with survival as well, right?
That's the stepchild of parapsychology, I know.
Right. Yeah. So even within the fringe topic of parapsychology, survival research is pretty on the edge there as well. Although it is getting more and more interest actually in the field. I'm always surprised when I see someone publish a paper or give a lecture or talk about very specific survival related topics. It's been gaining more traction the last few years, and that to me is pretty exciting.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating subject. And so you and Dr. Julie Beischel teamed up both in work and in life, and you founded the Windbridge Institute. How did that come about?
Yeah, so Julie and I met in 2005, but now flash forward to 2007, and I'm actually living in Arizona now. I moved to Tucson, and Julie was now finishing her postdoc work at the University of Arizona, and so this would have been late 2007, and she was like, well, what's my next move? What are we going to do? And so she started looking. She wanted to continue to do mediumship research. And so she reached out to some other departments at the U of A and in other places. And, mediumship research is pretty controversial, and there also isn't a lot of funding. So it became pretty difficult for her to find a home. And the two of us were sitting around and we're like, well, what are we going to do? And we had been talking to some other people, and the idea came up that, well, maybe it's time for us to start our own independent research organization. And so we scrounged around and we found some change in the couch, and we debated a name, and we talked to some other friends, and we talked to some advisors, and the idea of starting the Windbridge Institute was born. And the first thing we did was went out and we secured the domain name, windbridge.org, and then we filed the paperwork, and then by early 2008, we had officially formed the Windbridge Institute, LLC, for applied research in human potential.
Beautiful.
And that's how that started. And then Julie was able to use the Institute as a platform for her own work. So we were able to apply for different kinds of grants and get different kinds of funding. We attracted a team. Nothing ever happens in a vacuum, right? So something like the Windbridge Institute never would have happened if we didn't have collaborative researchers and amazing advisors and people on our scientific advisory board that stepped up, and people on our community boards, and just support from the general public of people who were like, yes, this needs to happen. So we were really, it was funny. We kind of felt like all these different doors were closing. And then the minute we sort of decided that, yeah, let's do the Institute, bam, all these doors started to open up for us, and all these opportunities started to open up for us. And we've been doing that for 10 years.
That's wonderful. And you worked with Julie in finding certain mediums who passed muster with the tests that were given, that they had they scored high on the reliability tests, that every time that they read someone in a quadruple blind manner, which Julie explained to us, as you developed a sort of stable of mediums that had a p-value reliability in their tests. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were a number of people involved in those projects in the early days of screening mediums and pre-screening mediums for use to see if they would qualify to participate in larger research studies. And so that particular screening process required 3 different investigators, and I was one of the investigators on that team. Julie was the lead investigator, and the way it works is the information's very, very segmented. So, for example, I never talked to a medium. Right, that was never part of my job, where Julie never talked to a sitter because that wasn't part of her job. So the information was all very compartmentalized. And so basically, for those studies, I just sort of pushed paperwork around, which is fine, because that's what a lot of research is involved in. These, like there needs to be the guy who makes sure everything flows and goes in order of things. So that was my stuff. So as far as the mediumship research goes, I really would like to point people back to Julie's interview that you did with her. I thought that was an excellent interview. And she is far more qualified to talk about the day-to-day details of the mediumship work at the Institute and now at the center than I am. That's really her. That's her area.
It's her ballywick, if you will.
Yeah, and I'll also just make this plug too. She wrote a really great little ebook called "Among Mediums: A Scientist's Quest for Answers," and it's available on Amazon. And it's short and it's quick and it's inexpensive, and it really sort of covers her background and sort of her overall approach to mediumship research to date. It's a little outdated now, but it's definitely worth a read if people haven't read it.
Well,
and they're interested in the topic.
She's amazing, and we did have her on the program, but today is your day to talk about what you're doing now and your research. Just stepping aside, sort of to the side, and getting back to your days of investigating ITC, you are aware that when we interviewed Tom Butler, who is quite well known in the ITC field. In fact, I believe, I'm not looking at his interview right at the moment because I'm talking to you, but I believe that his association is transcommunication is included in the name. It's instrumental transcommunication something. And he was on the show with us and gave a very powerful interview. And when we hung up with him, we had an instance of an EVP come on our show after we hung up with him. Now, our wonderful engineer, Bill, was recording on 3 different lines that day, 3 channels. And Tom's channel, he said goodbye. His channel was closed by Bill. So what remained was my channel and Kate Valentine's channel. And we were wrapping up the show, a little bit of banter that we do back and forth, tell people to like us on Facebook, etc. And all of a sudden, Kate hears this strange noise. Now, I could also hear the noise, but it was much clearer in her ear because it was coming through her track. And I know that you may have had an opportunity to listen to this 20-second clip that is on our show. So I wanted to know if you had an opinion on it, if you'd like to weigh in a little bit on what happened there.
Sure. So I did have a chance to listen to the clip, and it's cool, right? It's a really interesting sound. I couldn't really make out what it was exactly, but before I kind of go into that specifically, I think first off, I want to say that I love instrumental transcommunication as an area of research. I think it is really super interesting. I think it's really at its infancy in terms of what we truly understand about the phenomena. There's a lot of people out there doing a lot of really cool things, but a lot of it is taking place. And I don't want this to sound disparaging because it's not, but like in people's workshops and in basements and in their homes, and they're developing all these kinds of interesting techniques and technologies, and we're getting a lot of interesting reports of different kinds of phenomena that are being reported and different kinds of communication. But science hasn't really jumped on the bandwagon yet. And for better or for worse, right? For some people, they'll be like, what does science know? Science doesn't need to tell me what I'm experiencing. But as an empiricist, I think that stuff is fascinating. And I want to bring it into the lab. And like you mentioned, I've received a couple of grants from the Helene Reeder Memorial Fund to look at invited discarnate effects on different kinds of devices and things like that. And so I think this is a really cool area of inquiry. But I'm very cautious when I go into it, because while there's a lot of cool stories, like we had ghost stories in the field, I'm waiting for the rigor of the science to catch up with the experiences.
I agree with you on that, Mark, simply because when you're doing something in your basement or your workshop, if you don't have certain controls, which the scientific method provides, you can mistake something that is not communication for communication. But in terms of science, we don't want to move towards the realm of scientism as opposed to science, because that can really shut things down in a nasty way.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. And so I actually wrote a paper about an ITC paper with Julie. She co-authored it with me a few years ago. It was in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. It's available on our site. And it looked at a very specific kind of ITC using a piece of software called EVP Maker. And we looked at a bunch of different pieces of that experience. We looked at it statistically. We looked at it with using double-blinded, randomized listening panels. We got feedback from the actual operator who collected the samples, and so she gave us her impressions and her interpretation of what she was recording. And so it's very comprehensive. It was an exploratory study. I want to say that because we didn't have a lot of data. We didn't have a lot of experienced operators at the time. So it sort of just sets the framework of some methodology and some processes of how one might go ahead and look at certain kinds of ITC under controlled conditions. So the statistical results are underpowered, but I think it's all valid from my perspective. So anyway, so there are ways to do this, I think, scientifically and systematically, while still being respectful of the process and the phenomena. So for me, when I talk about ITC or EVP samples, there's sort of 5 levels of evaluation I kind of have to bring the thing through. And just really quickly, we need to know how the sample was collected. Was it a spontaneous sample, or was it collected under some kind of laboratory controlled conditions? And what exactly were those controls, and what were they controlling for or against, right, or accounting for? And then once we have the sample, we need to determine whether or not the sample was truly from a paranormal or anomalous source, right? And that's easier to do under controlled conditions than it is under spontaneous conditions, right? And then the third thing we need to do is, once we hear the sample, a lot of people try to assign meaning to the sample. And so this is where things get really difficult really quickly, because as human beings, we're trained to find meaning in chaos or meaning in noise. So things like listening panels and even speech recognition software or other kinds of techniques tend to fail at this. So at this point, as far as I know, there's no sound scientific methodological way to objectively determine the content of an EVP message. Okay, so a lot of it is subjective, right? What does it mean to the person who received the message? Then the next thing we look at, so the next thing that people try to do is try to determine the source, right? Where did it come from? Was it actually from a discarnate or a deceased person? Was it from an alien? Was it from was it from a spirit guide? Those kinds of things. And that becomes even more difficult. And so that's where these sort of leaps in process sort of come in, because what we've learned from mediumship research and other things is that you can't determine the source of a message, based on its content.
No, that's really clear, because just going over for a moment to alien things having to do with others, we really don't have any idea if someone feels that they're channeling Mother Mary, that it isn't some non-physical entity sharing space with us, or if it's, Mork from Zork. It could be an alien lying to you, telling you that they're Mother Mary. And there's no objective way to determine that, whether it be in EVP or whether it be in a medium communication for that matter. But it's just a matter if you get good info or if you don't get good info.
Right, exactly. Yeah, is what's being said verifiable? And if it's not, which is often my experience with EVP content, is that it's not often veridical information, right? It's often a message of some kind, right? Which isn't like, you're wearing a blue shirt. It's like, I'm scared, or hello, or get out, or whatever, right? It's things like that. So really then the interesting bit for me is this fifth step, which is assessing the impact of the communication on the person who received it, right? So how does that communication make that person feel? Is it healing? Is it helpful? Is it frightening? Is it interesting? Is it so? So that's kind of the process and framework that I use as I look at EVP, as I design EVP experiments or ITC experiments, and so on. So let's talk specifically about your sample. So first off, it was a spontaneous sample.
Yes.
Since there were no controls in place, I think it's very difficult to determine whether or not it's truly a paranormal sample. It's certainly an unexpected sample.
There are some controls. If I could just interrupt for a moment and say that the three of us, our engineer, Kate Valentine, and myself, we're all in a room together doing the show. And though Tom Butler was not in the room, he was gone from the event, and his channel was completely turned off. And being in the room together, the control was that we all had mutual surprise at what had occurred, and we could see each other, and that the sound only came through on Kate's feed. It wasn't, since we're all in the room together at close quarters, not intimately close quarters, but a few feet apart. It didn't come up on any of our other feeds on the other channels. It was strictly on Kate's channel, and the only way it could be heard was not in the room, not on the other channels, just on Kate's. So that's the control there. Now, that may not be the control you're looking for, and it didn't have any particular meaning to us, nor a terrible emotional impact, except to our dear engineer, who couldn't figure out how the ghost got in the machine, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Right. So we can probably rule out any sort of specific vocalization from a person. Right?
Absolutely. Right.
But even as I'm talking to you now over Skype, right, we're using this third-party system. You're breaking up. I'm hearing a slight echo. So these communication channels, these electronic communication channels, are not perfect and flawless by any stretch of the imagination. So we need to open up the door to the possibility that there was some anomaly taking place. There's some explainable anomaly. But what's actually more interesting to me isn't the sound or how the sound was created, but the timing of the sound.
Exactly.
Right? That's really interesting, right? So, you just had, and how, I'm assuming that these kinds of anomalies don't pop up in your other interviews.
No, not at all.
Okay. So, but here you go. You're talking to Tom Butler, you're talking about EVP, and now you're quiet for a second, and that's like the perfect moment for something to go awry, right? So it's really interesting. It's a cool story, right? It's a cool, but empirically, right? Looking through the lens of it, looking through the empirical lens, it's very difficult to go, oh, yes, that was clearly a paranormal event. That was clearly the result of some external influence, whether it was operator psi or PK or some discarnate entity. Like I can't in good conscience make those kinds of leaps.
No, of course not.
But I can say, that's cool. Please let me know if that happens again. Keep an eye out for it. Right. That's really interesting. So here's an example. We ran a study and we published the poster at a conference, and it was kind of fun. What we were looking at. So a lot of people take photographs and they have orbs in them.
Yes.
Right. So, so these sort of density spots or anomalies. Right. So, and it's been pretty well established that those are not photographs of ghosts or spirits, right? They're the results of those anomalies are dust and reflection and camera errors, and they're easily repeatable and those kinds of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
We agree with that?
It can be. Yeah, it can certainly be.
But what's really interesting to me is as I started to talk to people about their photographic experiences, I was like, why did you take a photo at that time, at that place? And a lot of people said, oh, well, I felt compelled to do it. I don't know. I just needed to take a picture there. And sometimes some of our mediums have even said, oh, if you take a picture of this thing at this time, at this place, your discarnate will make him or herself known to you. And people will do that, and there will be some sort of photographic anomaly in the picture, right?
Yes.
So that to me is super interesting, right? So we may not be photographing ghosts, right? But we may be photographing physical phenomena, which is being created through some sort of psychokinetic effect or precognitive effect or precognitive event that's inspiring or instructing people to tell people to take photographs at a specific place at a specific time.
Yes.
So to test this idea, we set up a bunch of lasers. And we invited discarnates to move dust in a home area, in a house, to move around and push dust in front of the lasers at specific times. And it was randomized, counterbalanced, controlled thing. And I don't remember how many sessions we ran off the top of my head, but a bunch of them. And then we would photograph the lasers. And so we were able to capture all the dust that appeared in the laser. And then we used special software to quantify the amount of dust material that was in every photograph for each session. And then we compared controls to active sessions. And what we found was that there was a statistical difference between the control sessions and the active sessions.
Well,
but it was in the
good.
Opposite direction.
The wrong direction.
There was more dust in the controls than there were in the active sessions. So when we asked the discarnates to move dust around, they moved it, but they moved it out of the beam.
Huh.
So the beam target may have been too small, or there could have been a bunch of reasons for that. But so there's that kind of thing, which was really interesting and something I really want to get back to replicating someday when I have time and funding. And then I ran another experiment where we were at a haunted hotel, and I put people, investigators, ghost hunters, in different locations in the hotel where anomalies had been reported.
Which hotel, Mark? Which hotel?
Oh, I don't want to say.
Okay,
honestly.
I just wondered because we've had a lot of people talk about the Del Coronado Hotel in Southern California. Both one of our listeners who had an amazing experience with a television which went on by itself and displayed a person who probably was deceased and perhaps murdered in the hotel. And then a few sessions ago, we had Preston Dennett on, who is a paranormal, not investigator so much as a chronicler of mostly UFO experiences, but he's gone into other areas as well. And, does quite a nice job of just chronicling what people say, which is also a valuable skill. And so it was, all these things happened at the Del Coronado. So that's why I asked which one, but you don't have to say.
Yeah. No, I'm familiar with the Del Coronado, and it has a great history. But no, this was a hotel in Arizona. And so I had all these people spread around, and their job was to take photographs whenever they felt inspired. And they did. And then we had them take a series of pre-selected control photographs where they were told to take a specific photograph at a specific time in a specific location. And we compared those two groups of photos. And sure enough, there were statistically more anomalies in the inspired photographs than in the control photographs.
Excellent.
So there's something about feeling, there's some connection there between a feeling like you need your internal feeling motivating you to take a picture. And again, you might not be taking a picture of a ghost, but maybe the ghost is like giving you a hint that now is a good time to take the picture. So it's those kinds of things. So I love these synchronicities that happen with these sort of anomalous events.
May I make a suggestion?
Yeah, go ahead.
In my experience, I've spent a lot of time traveling to sacred sites, and I found that, I'm an avid photo taker, just socially and otherwise. But when I would go to these sacred sites, mostly stone circles in Great Britain and Ireland, I found that there were many more light anomalies occurring, not necessarily the typical dust mote or water vapor orbs, but these light anomalies. And then I found that it also occurred when I was doing a swim with the dolphins in the Caribbean near the quote-unquote Bermuda Triangle. I don't know that the Bermuda Triangle had anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. But so my suggestion would just be to maybe check out these energy centers from past times, these stone circles and other dolmens, etc.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I'd love to do that. That would be great. I will have to try to get funding for that.
Okay. You heard it here, funders.
Yes.
Give Mark some funding to maybe we can all travel to Great Britain and take some photos together. I'll volunteer to participate.
That would be wonderful. You could guide the expedition. Yeah, that would be great. Very cool. So how did those photographs make you feel? Like when you saw those anomalies, like what was your experience in seeing them?
Well, when I was I think a lot of them came in a trip to Scotland. I did have some anomalies on photos from England and Ireland, but when I was in Scotland and I was intensively going to one stone circle after the other, one dolmen after the other, the old Hillow Stains I visited, and up in the Orkney Islands, etc. I was kind of on a mission. And so it made me feel good that I was kind of connecting with my mission, I felt, and when I say drawing down power, that's really kind of exaggerating the situation a little bit, but getting into the feeling of the stone circle is the best way I can explain it. It kind of made me feel like, mission accomplished.
Right,
But I
right.
didn't have, what I didn't have, it wasn't informational to me in any way. I didn't get information from it. However, when I was on the dolphin swim with, on what are those boats called that are pontoon boats? I can't think of the word for the pontoon boat, but we were out there in the Caribbean, in the Bermuda Triangle, and we would get off the boat and jump in when we spotted a school of dolphins, and the idea of getting beamed by the dolphins was an amazing experience, but the visual part of the anomalies, I think I was lost at sea for a matter of minutes when the boat left without me, and the visual phenomena, I believe, happened right after that. And that had more emotional meaning to me, that I actually was able to get back on the boat and wasn't lost at sea. So, so that had a big emotional response from me. That's sort of
That's cool. That's really interesting.
Yeah, my
it's
dolphins
interesting
were with me.
you bring up dolphins. I'm having a lot of weird synchronicities around dolphins the last few days. So that's sort of serendipity-ish that you brought that up in this conversation.
Well, I will further
photographic anomalies. So
I will further
cool.
bring up dolphins just to give a plug to the Monroe Institute's dolphin. Oh boy, here I go again. The dolphin, not research committee, the dolphin. They have a dolphin program which helps people to heal. You meditate on dolphins and try to bring healing to people who are ill. And
really?
I think
didn't know about that.
it's just fabulous. It's a fabulous program for healing people who want to be healed, and so dolphins are mentioned there as well.
That's awesome. So that's the Monroe Institute?
Yes, and I'm a member of the Dolphin Association there.
Wow, that's great. So cool. Yeah. So what else?
So we're going back to your what you're doing today. And now I understand from Dr. Beischel that just to confuse matters completely on your part, you are also working with another prominent parapsychologist, Dr. Julia Morsbridge of the Morsbridge Institute. Now, couldn't you guys come up with a couple of different names?
It was, I know, it's ridiculous. The Mossbridge Institute, the Windbridge Institute. It's funny. I remember when we were sitting down with Julia, I don't know, years ago, and we were at some conference somewhere, and I was like, really? Mossbridge Institute? And she was like, oh, yeah, right. I just see that now. Yeah.
And Julia, that doesn't confuse things.
Yeah,
at all.
yeah, that doesn't confuse it. Yeah. And, there's a number of things that are going on. So first I want to say that, so just to wrap up about the Institute and the center and things like that. So as we may have mentioned, so the Institute kind of rolled along doing its mediumship and general parapsychology research until 2016, when we said, wow, we are taking on way too much stuff, and we're having a really hard time serving our audiences, because there were all these people that were like, hey, we want to know about mediumship and afterlife research. And then there were all these other people that were like, no, we want to know about precognition and telepathy and clairvoyance and those kinds of things. So every time I'd send out an email, half the people would be mad because I was either not covering enough of one topic or too much of another or that kind of thing. So we were really realizing that we were serving these different audiences, and we were having a hard time treating them or giving them what they needed. And there was also sort of a division in the research as well. And so in 2017, we decided to split off the afterlife research and form a new nonprofit 501c3 charity called the Windbridge Research Center. Mm-hmm. And that is the home now of all of our mediumship and afterlife and ITC research, where the Windbridge Institute now still focuses on primarily mindfulness and intuition and intention research. And so there's actually two separate websites now. There's the windbridgeinstitute.com, which is the home of the Windbridge Institute LLC, and there's windbridge.org, which is the home of the Windbridge Research Center, which studies dying, death, and what comes next. So there's that whole bit of confusion as well. So
you don't make it easy for us out here.
No, we don't. I'm sorry. We wanted to keep the name Windbridge, and we had a lot of stuff. So Julie is still involved in the Institute, and I'm still involved in the center. I'm actually the executive director of the center, and I'm the managing editor of our free open access online peer-reviewed journal called Threshold. So that's being published through the center. And then I'm also conducting other kinds of research and developing apps and books and other tools under the Institute, which is a for-profit endeavor. And we do consulting work and things like that.
So I'm all about intention. I work with intention nearly every day on some level, often with my clients, often separately. So I'm most interested in your work having to do with intention. So do you want to give us a little rundown about that?
Sure. So this goes down the rabbit hole pretty quickly, and it's pretty speculative, but I love it. And it's a few years ago, I started working in ITC actually, and other sorts of areas where I was using equipment to monitor different things. So I was using random event generators to see if intention would affect the output of random event generators. I was using environmental monitors to see if invited discarnates or operator intention could change the output of these devices. And so I'm running all the normal statistical tests, and I'm getting some results and I'm not getting some results. And I kind of had this idea, there's a very standard technique called visualization, right? Mm-hmm. Data visualization. And so it's when you take your data and you turn it into a picture of some kind. And a lot of people turn that stuff into a graph or a bar chart. And I was like, well, is there some other way that we might be able to look at this dynamic data that changes over time? So I started to animate it and turn it into 3D shapes and sort of colorize it in different ways. And the images were really interesting aesthetically. And so to sort of give people an idea of what the heck I'm talking about here, so I did write a book. It's called Visualizing Intention, Art Informed by Science. And if you go to windbridgeinstitute.com, you can, there's a link on the homepage that says SciForms Visualizing Intention. And if you click on that link, in the very first paragraph on the page that it loads, there's going to be a line and it says you can buy the book from Amazon or you can download the free PDF. Go ahead and download the free PDF. The book is full color. It's 100 pages. It's custom printed. It's ridiculously expensive on Amazon. It's like $40 or $50.
It's visually beautiful, though, I'd say.
Thank you. Yeah, the book is gorgeous, and I really love what the printers did with it and the layout. It looks really nice. But I don't expect everyone to go out and fork up that much money for basically a little coffee table book. So if you're into it, if you download the PDF, you'll see the whole book. You can see all the pictures. You can get a sense of what I'm talking about. So we'll wait. No, okay, sorry. And if you love it and you want a hard copy, you can purchase the book, and that would be lovely because it helps pay for some of this work. So there you go. So I'm visualizing these data, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting and this is really cool. And I'm showing some of the pieces up on social media, and I'm getting a lot of really interesting feedback. And people are like, oh, I kind of see your intention in the picture. And I'm like, well, that's cool and totally subjective, but cool. So I ran specific sessions where I had people focus on a specific intention and write that intention down. And then while they were doing that, I was wherever they were around the world. I was in my lab here in Arizona, and I ran a random event generator, and I put the person's name on the random event generator with a sticky note. And I collected data while they meditated on it, while they meditated on their intention. And then I took the data and I ran it through the software, and I would show them the pictures. And they were also to report and document any sensations or feelings or thoughts that they had during the process. And I'm showing these people these images, and the feedback is really interesting. And some of those examples are in the book. So you can read how people actually felt as if they saw their intentions manifested in the image. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so we continue to do that in a number of different ways. And over time, the project sort of morphed into more of an art project than a pure science project, because I was starting to take a number of liberties with the way the data were presented. Because if I didn't add some randomness or noise, or change the color schemes a little bit, or search for certain patterns in the data and try to enhance those in certain ways, so the images wouldn't be as interesting. So I'm hesitant to say that these are true scientific representations of the data, but so they're sort of artistic interpretations of the data. And again, as what's clearly has been a running theme through this conversation is that I'm really interested in how things make people feel and what their experiences are. And so this seemed to be really a positive thing that people were having. Go ahead.
Okay. I have two things to speak to about your experiment and how I see things in that regard. And we have had a couple of guests on, most specifically recently Laird Scranton, who goes around looking at pre-literate civilizations and symbols they use. We had a young lady from Australia who worked in something similar but different. Lynn was her first name. And so we could look at certain symbols that may have some universal meaning to humans on several levels, like a circle with a dot inside it, for instance, which brings me to my own work. I have a master's degree in fine arts as well as working as a professional intuitive. And in my work in computer art, I began to see how certain colorful compositions with multiple polka dots seem to make everyone happy. So I wanted to throw that out there, just as a something to perhaps to speak to around what you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am the first one to say that this is very subjective, right? So these people's personal experiences are their own, and you can project whatever. And somebody even says that in the book. They're like, you can see whatever you want in these images. What I see is relevant to me because blah. And she goes on to tell her story. There's one image in the book that actually was created when someone was focusing on their anxiety. Oh. And it's a really interesting image because it feels very different to me than the other images. And he used it as a sort of a kicking off point for his own sort of reflection about his anxiety and how it fit into his worldview and scheme. So there's things like that as well. The other piece of this, which gets even a little stranger, is so a lot of my friends, believe it or not, are actual scientists. And clearly most of my colleagues are scientists. So every time I would talk about this stuff, they were like, you have to run an empirical experiment. You have to do this under blinded conditions. You have where's your data? What's your finding? And I was like, this is so difficult to do in any meaningful way. So a lot of people were comparing it to the work of Emoto with his ice crystal work.
Right,
Are you familiar with that?
Masahiro Emoto, some Japanese scientist with water crystals and freezing ice with different words. I'm just cutting to the chase here.
Yeah. So no, absolutely. So a lot of people were equating it to that, but the thing that's beautiful about that work is that when the intention is positive, the images are very symmetrical. And like you said with the polka dots, human brains and human beings like things that are symmetrical. The art that I'm generating is much more subjective and it feels a bit more random. So I was worried that human perception might prevent people from accurately determining whether or not these images were pretty or not pretty or that kinds of things. So I removed the human participant in a couple of different studies. One of these is in the book, but I actually compared the color spectrums of two data sets. One where the intention or the focus of the intention was on a feeling of love, and the other was on the feeling of hate. And there is a clear difference in the color spectrum of these two data sets.
Wow.
And that's statistically significant.
Well, that
difference.
That is just really very fascinating, and the idea of like blurring the line a little bit between science and art. I find maybe there are scientists who may reject that, but I find it very interesting myself.
Yeah, I'm the first. Sorry, so I'm the first one to say weird and controversial, right? And I don't quite know what to make of it yet. As a follow-up to that experiment, and I presented this at the Society for Scientific Exploration a couple of years ago, I got the same data sets and I made them into images and I gave them to a deep learning machine classifier. So this was a piece of software, artificial intelligence software, that was designed to extract features out of photographs. And it was trained using millions of photographs on the internet. And when I gave it those two sets of images, it sent me back a list of features in each one. And what was interesting about that test is that in 4 of the 5 hate images, there was a specific feature that wasn't, there were a lot of overlaps between the two images in terms of features. But in the 4 or 5 of these hate images, there was a single feature that didn't appear anywhere else.
And it was?
So that, triangular. Apparently there were a lot more triangles and hard edges in the hate images than there were in the love images.
Well, from that, could we say that it occurs to me that you have sharper angles when you have triangles. It might not be the actual triangle, but the angle that's more pointed.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be. But the issue here is that, or the interesting bit, is that statistically, if you look at the raw data, it's exactly the same data. There's no difference statistically between the love data set and the hate data set.
I don't know what that means.
I don't know either, but it's really cool. If I'm going to speculate, I'm playing with this idea that data sets or data become a vector for intention. And I'm actually going to present a poster at the upcoming Society for Scientific Exploration meeting, which is happening in Las Vegas in June, where I used love and hate data sets to control an online game. And then I asked people to measure their self-reported level of happiness before playing the game and after playing the game. And there's a statistically significant difference between the level of happiness, which increased with people that played the happy love data game versus the people whose mood decreased after playing the sad game. And again, it's the exact same game. It's just certain aspects of the game are controlled. And then there was a controlled game where there was no reported difference in the pre and post happiness scores. All that's going to be available in June.
Well, very, very interesting. I hope to see you there and look at your poster. And just before we go, we sort of like at time now. We do have to say goodbye very shortly. But I think the one verbiage that you used that our listeners may not universally understand is what is a poster at an event. It's not just a flat piece of paper. It's more than that.
It actually is a flat piece of paper.
But it's more than that.
But yeah. At a scientific conference, you can be granted either a talk where you get up and you present, typically with a PowerPoint presentation or whatever, to the crowd, or you're given a poster session, which is where some topics, and it's up to the jurors as to how they make this decision, but some topics are covered by you create a large a poster, literally a poster. It's 3 or 4 feet by 3 or 4 feet, and it goes up on the wall, and then a bunch of people present them, and it outlines your methods and your experiment and your data and your findings, and it's sort of a brief way for people to walk up, get a bunch of information relevant to this study, and then they can ask you questions, and you can interact with people one-on-one. I typically have handouts. People can walk away with it and follow up with me later. But it's a way for people at a conference to get a lot more information about a lot of different studies really, really quickly, just the high-level bullet points for each one.
I think it's great. I think it's a great practice. And to bring it home to people, by me having gone to a number of these conferences and not being a scientist, how I would tell the average person what it's like going to the poster sessions are like going to very sophisticated and informative science projects, like if you have a science fair at a high school where kids are making certain experiments and explaining it to people as they pass by. But instead, these are real scientists. They're not high school kids. They've got real strong data, and they're presenting it to you as you pass by. And it's really an unbelievably positive experience. It was for me. So, Mark Boccuzzi, co-founder of the Windbridge Institute, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. And we hope to have both you and Dr. Beischel back in the future. And we are, in fact, planning to have the editor of your journal, David Metcalf, on in the not too distant future. We've got to have a few people in between all the Windbridge people, but we're planning on having him on a variety of topics, including the journal.
That's wonderful. David is an amazing guy. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thanks again, and looking forward to seeing you and Julie in June.
Excellent.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.
So this was a very, very interesting discussion, and I wish we had more time because I think Mark had a lot of more stuff to tell us about, but we do have a time constraint. And I just want to review with you, my listening audience, that we have 2 websites. The first one is shatteredrealitypodcast.com. The second one is shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com. And at this moment, that's the one that's completely up to date. We, in addition, have a YouTube channel, Shattered Reality Podcast. And we have a Facebook page, which appears to be a radio station. We are not a radio station. We are a podcast, and we hope for more likes on our Facebook page and comments on all of the other 3 mediums, the 2 blog sites, and as well as on our YouTube listening. So we're hoping to have Miss Kate Valentine back on next week with us. But for now, let me just say goodbye from Shattered Reality.